Unlike, say, an Excel workbook or an image that you might be manipulating in Photoshop, those are binary files. And when you're working with code, you are almost always working with, well, straight up plain ASCII text. I mean, if you wanted to, you could edit all of your code files inside of Notepad. Now, I wouldn't recommend it. It's not a very powerful utility, and there's no really good reason to use Notepad. I assume if you're using Notepad to write your code, you are either under some incredible environment and infrastructure constraints, or you are just a crazy person. So no, most people do not use Notepad to write their code, even though you technically could. I mean, that's what you're writing. Instead, we tend to use something known as Integrated Development Environments, IDEs they're called. And IDEs are these cool, robust utilities and programs that we can use to write our code, and they offer all kinds of different features to help us write that code. Everything from syntax highlighting to project management to IntelliSense, auto-completion for our code. So IDEs, an integrated development environment, is maybe the most important tool that a programmer is going to use. Because of that, programmers and developers have a lot of strong emotional opinions about what the right IDE to use is. Now, I am not here to make that judgment for you. I'm not so crazy that I'm going to come out and stake a claim about the best IDE. Frankly, the best IDE is going to be the one that fits the job that you're facing at the time, and a lot of us end up using an IDE for a lot of different reasons. Instead, I want to talk about one specific IDE, VS Code, if you couldn't tell from the title of this video, and why I'm choosing to use it for my programming these days. And to do that, I want to talk a little bit about your IDE options that are out there. To begin with, your full-featured IDEs tend to look like this. Notice they're very complex, very dense information on these little screens. I'm talking about IDEs like Visual Studio or NetBeans or IntelliJ. And these are pretty powerful utilities. They are, like I mentioned before, very feature-rich. They're very well supported. The companies behind them, the companies that support them, ensure that they are up-to-date and secure, and they contain all of the latest features. And they're very widely adopted. I think Visual Studio might be one of the most popular IDEs on the planet because it's the IDE that's used for C#. Now, with that in mind, though, there are some cons to them. They are very tightly coupled to the programming language that they are intended to support. Visual Studio, for all of its power and all of its features, is really tightly coupled to .NET. It was developed alongside of .NET, and it's always been intended to be used with .NET. NetBeans is very tightly coupled to Java. If you're using NetBeans, you're probably using it to write Java code. And while any of these IDEs can technically be used to write other code, that's not really what they're meant for. They're also very complex. There can be a really steep learning curve for these IDEs because they contain so many features, because they are so bloated. They can be slow to load, difficult to learn. These are the kind of things that you use when you really need to work on a large-scale enterprise application in a language they are specifically designed to support. Now, on the flip side, something that's become more popular in recent years is using something like a simple text editor. I talked about Notepad a second ago. No one's really using Notepad to code. Frankly, that would be crazy. But there are alternatives that are similar to Notepad, just more fully featured, a little bit richer than Notepad. Things like Notepad++, a really popular option because it looks a lot like Notepad, but of course it's got that plus because it's more than just Notepad. And it's free. Sublime Text Vim is another very popular code editor, text editor. And these editors are advantageous because they're quick and easy to set up. They're often extensible. They support plugins so you can expand and add features onto them. They're widely available and often free to use or incredibly inexpensive. But on the downside, there's some cons to them as well. They are feature poor. Unlike the full-featured IDEs, which have everything in the kitchen sink that you might ever want to use, these are generally very basic code editors with some simple syntax highlighting and maybe build automation. Now, they are often extensible, but that often means that they have a tedious configuration or setup for your environment as well. So you may be having to configure them with a lot of different options located in text files like JSON or XML. So it can take some learning and some time there to get them set up and configured for your environment. So, of course, enter the third option, what I call the split the difference option. And this has become super popular in recent years. Some different applications and utilities for writing code like Atom or Brackets. These are similar to text editors in that they are generally basic and very simple and straightforward. They're not the full-featured IDEs like Visual Studio or Eclipse, but they're not simple and basic text editors like Notepad. They include a lot of features that you would use for writing code specifically. They are extensible, they support plugins, they are designed with a programmer, with a coder in mind. And the one that I would like, and the one that I want to talk about, of course, is VS Code, also called Visual Studio Code, because Microsoft cannot abandon a brand. So VS Code is a very popular code editor these days that does all those things. It really splits the difference between the two that I just talked about there. It's got a lot of support for extensions, a lot of flexibility, but out of the box, it's very simple, straightforward, and easy to use, including syntax highlighting, and you can get started with it right away. In fact, I'd recommend that you load up code.visualstudio.com and simply download the version of VS Code for your platform. You'll notice it's available for Mac, Windows, or Linux, and you can install this and get started right away. I'm not going to walk you through that because, frankly, you just click Install, walk through the wizard, and it's done. It's installed. Once Visual Studio Code is installed, it looks a little bit something like this. I've got this running live on my system. It is a very straightforward application. On the far right-hand side here, you have an editor pane where it's showing you whatever file you have open. In the middle here, you have a number of flyout tabs that show you your folder or your workspace that you're working with. And then on the left, you have a few of the different features, the Explorer, the search option, you have a source control option. Here's the extensions option. It looks like these little bricks. And when you click this, you can search for extensions to expand your Visual Studio Code installation. So if I look here and I select the Python extension, for example, I actually already have it installed. That's why this option here is uninstall. So this means I have already set up to use Python instead of Visual Studio Code, and I did that simply by finding the Python extension and clicking an install button. I'm going to talk a lot about how to do this in some other videos. So this is Visual Studio Code, VS Code, and my preferred code editor these days. I hope you understand now why I've chosen it and what features it's going to offer to you, and I hope you stick around and watch some more videos on how you can configure and set up Visual Studio Code for your development environment. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.